Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today we are taking a look at the America B group for the 2023 Overwatch World Cup. This is the penultimate group for the World Cup qualifiers. And this is the South America group, so all of the teams in this group coming from South America. Those 6 countries are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. This is a very interesting group to me. I know I mentioned when I talked about EMECA that I thought that was one of the most interesting groups in the World Cup qualifiers. This is the other group that I think is most interesting. To me, EMECA and America B are the most interesting groups. And the reason why this group is interesting is because if you look at the history of South American Overwatch, here's a little history lesson for everyone, for those who are unaware. South America has always been one of the most underrepresented regions in Overwatch contenders and in the Overwatch League. There's a total of about 2 players, depending on how you want to define it, who hail from South America, who have made it into the Overwatch League. You had Alemão back in the day from Brazil, who was on the Boston Uprising for a period. And you have EQO, who is of Colombian descent, who moved to Israel. So he was usually represented as a player from Israel, but he is of Colombian descent. And so South America has always been a kind of an underrepresented region. Of course, there used to be Contender South America, and that got axed. I want to say back in like 2019, 2020, they got rid of the South America region. I think it was 2020 where they got rid of it. And ever since, South America has just kind of been left to its own devices. There hasn't really been a lot of competition at a super high, kind of Blizzard-backed level. So it's a very homegrown region at this point in time. A lot of this talent are players who are not going to be people with big, major kind of tournament experience, big LAN experience in a World Cup setting or an Overwatch League or a contender setting. So it's a very interesting region with a lot of players who are going to try to prove themselves here at the World Cup this year. And that's why I think this is a fascinating region. I think there's a ton of really interesting things going on here, and I'm super excited to see how this group plays out. Let's start with the first country here, which is Argentina. Of course, Argentina won the FIFA World Cup in 2022, so they're riding high off of that victory there. I'll throw the roster up on the screen. You can see it here. They have damage dealers Gatsby, Walter, and Oracle. Pretty unknown trio here. From my research, I couldn't really find a whole lot about these players. Walter is going to be a flex DPS player. He's going to be able to, pull out your stuff like your Mei and whatnot. That's his kind of hero pool. But Gatsby and Oracle, I could not find much on these players. Gatsby is a Grandmaster level damage dealer. I don't necessarily know who his best heroes are, what we get. I think Gatsby is a hit scan player based on some of their tweets, but I don't know 100% exactly that's what they play. And I have nothing about Oracle. Oracle has pretty much nothing to go off of on Twitter. So my guess is Walter, flex DPS player, with Gatsby as a hit scan player and Oracle filling in some of those other spots. I don't know exactly. I would imagine probably some kind of flex DPS hit scan hybrid type of player, but I don't know exactly. Interesting team because of the unknown, though, in that way. The tanks, you have Herd and Compasión. Herd is an off-tank player. So Compasión, my understanding is that he is a main tank player. Plays stuff like Ball quite a bit. So that's what you have with your tanks. Once again, neither of them have major kind of tournament experience that I have been able to kind of find. And finally, you have the supports, which you have Samuel and Gaston. Once again, very little, or Cruz and Gaston. Samuel is his actual name. But Cruz and Gaston are the supports. Gaston would, of course, be Okuno. So it's an interesting team, right? A lot of unknown players here. Players who have really very limited experience in the full kind of scene. They've not really been some of those players kind of on some of those big teams who have done a whole lot so far in the Overwatch Esports scene. They're competitors. They play on ladder. They have talent. Can they bring that talent to the stage and be able to kind of lock in a spot in Anaheim? We don't know yet. But they're an interesting team, I think, and it's one of those ones where Argentina historically has been one of the more interesting countries if you look at their history. Like I said, historically, the South American teams have not been great. They did not participate in the 2019 World Cup, but in 2016, they finished outside of the qualification in the America qualifier. They played in the Shanghai qualifier in 2017, and were pretty handily beaten there. It's a different region, though, of course, now. They're not playing against as many teams globally. They're playing against much more localized competition in South America. You look at who they had to play when they were playing in Shanghai. They were playing against countries like China and Denmark and France, Norway, countries that have a ton of history and a ton of success. Specifically, they had France and Denmark in their group, and they also had Thailand. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how they carry themselves. But they're a country that I think there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks. I don't think they appear to be one of the favorites out of this group based on what I understand, but it is possible that they are a surprising kind of dark horse team and they're able to pull things together and get some wins where they can move on to that top 16. Up next, we have Brazil, one of the more recognizable countries in the esports scene, especially big in Valorant. Very, very talented there, where they have found a lot of success. This Brazil roster comprises of Ludwig, Svenko, and the Sirius Guy, who I believe... Sirius Guy is more of a flex player, but I think mostly damage player. Ludwig has been in the Overwatch World Cup in the past. Was on the team in 2019, though that team did not compete in the main event, but has trialed and made it to a team before. He's going to be the flex DPS player for this team. You have Svenko, who is going to kind of round out some of those other heroes. Sirius Guy, I believe, like I said, is the flex DPS player. I don't think we're going to see as much of Sirius Guy. I think mostly known for Doomfist and then some other heroes in the damage role as well. So I think it'll probably mostly be Svenko, who does play a lot of that hit scan, and Ludwig, who plays a lot of those flex heroes. And then the Sirius Guy will kind of come in to cover if they need that for the roster. You then have Dalka and Neil as the tanks. Neil, interestingly enough, was on the team Brazil for 2017 and 2018, but did not play on the team in 2019 that didn't compete. So he has experience. He's a player who's been around. He's going to be a main tank player for this roster. Dalka is going to be your off-tank player. You have some of that well-rounded stuff. You have some of those players. A lot of these players are actually retired, formerly played in Contenders South America. You have experience there. Neil, most recently on the team Dignity. Dalka, most recently on the team War Pigs. The Sirius Guy, and they say. Svenko, and they say. And Ludwig on War Pigs. So a lot of these guys have played together as well. They know how to kind of play alongside of each other. And they come from pretty successful teams in South America, all things considered. Finally, of your supports, Neol and Xfel. Xfel is going to be your flex support player. Neol, your main support player, most likely, though they do have a lot of kind of crossover in their hero pool. Neol played on the team War Pigs. Xfel played on the team, and they say. So a lot of these players, like I said, have played together in the past. They've been on teams together, whether it be all of them or just some of them. They're from a very, very, kind of strong background in esports in Brazil. I think it is very important to note how successful Brazil has been in other esports. They may not have the same level of success in Overwatch as some of the other esports that they play in, but in Valorant in particular, Brazil is arguably a top country in Valorant, and they are a very good country when it comes to kind of esports, specifically in shooters. So I think there's a lot of room for this team to be good, especially when you consider the fact that their coach Honorato was on the World Cup team in 2018, in 2019, also has been there, has been around. So I think Brazil right now, when I look around, I think this is probably the favorite to come out of this South America group, to come out of America B. They just have a lot more of what you kind of expect. They have a lot more of that history, a lot more of that kind of infrastructure that we've seen in place in esports in Brazil. Brazil has been very, very strong in esports, and I think this region has a lot of unknowns. Brazil, to me, feels like the region with the most amount of known players, the least amount of question marks. Yes, it's a lot of players that haven't played at the highest end in a while, but that's kind of South America right now in general. A lot of players that have not been at the highest level. And so I think Brazil really is in the driver's seat when you just think of experience, and level of competition and kind of the highs that we can expect out of them, I think Brazil is probably one of the countries in the best spot coming out of this group. Moving on now, let's talk about Chile, another country with not a ton of experience when it comes to the World Cup, though. They did do decently well in 2016 in the American qualifier. They did win the American qualifier, beating out Colombia in that one. So they did make it to the overall World Cup in 2016. They were one of the top 16 teams represented there. Unfortunately for them, it did not go particularly well when they were there. Brazil also was in that event as well. They finished in the bottom 4 in their respective group. They both kind of went 0-2, 0-3 in Brazil's case. Just very quick kind of eliminations for them. Just not a very good run from them historically. So now they come in with a new look roster led by one player with some World Cup experience, and that is Debaut. This is another team that has players that have been together for the World Cup but haven't participated. It's unfortunately a trend that a lot of the South American countries just could not get their players to Anaheim in 2019. But if you look at this roster, you can see that they have players Debaut and Ram as their damage dealers, tank players Apple and Frack, and supports Papo, Lazu, and Poplats. So Debaut's going to be the primary hit scan player for this team. Played in Contenders for a bit on the team Up Gaming, who played in, of course, Contender South America. And mostly now plays Valorant, but has made a return here for this. Ram is going to play stuff like Tracer. That's one of their heroes that they play at a high level. So you kind of expect some kind of Tracer and hit scan looks would probably be the most likely thing you would expect from this team. You have Apple and you have Frack as the tanks. Not a lot of information I could gather from these two, other than the fact that they did, at least Frack, play in Contenders in the past. So not a ton of experience there. But when you get to their support lines, you start to see a little bit more, where you have Papo, who formerly played for the team Aggressive, is a flex support player. I think going to be kind of the starting flex support there. And then you have another flex support in Lazu, and you have your main support in Poplats. So they have the kind of well-rounded nature. They have some experience. Some players have played in Contenders a little while ago. So I think there's another interesting team where they have some of that kind of experience. I think that they're in a decent spot. I don't think they're favorites to get out of this group. I think Brazil is probably the number one favorite. I would put Chile in the kind of tier where they think it's possible they move on. I think it depends in a lot of ways on who you end up against and how teams look. I think there's a couple of teams really that are competing for that second spot out of this group. I think Brazil should be one of the teams that gets out, and then I think Chile is a potential option to get out as well. It's complicated to say exactly. I've been saying for a lot of these videos, the thing I think you need the most is a superstar player. You need someone who you can rely on to just kind of carry you to wins. I imagine that's going to be Debaut for this team. He's going to be the guy that they want to kind of lean on. I don't know if he is going to be the same level of player that you have in some of the other regions, but in this region, he might be enough to kind of help you get out of this group. But it's very tough to kind of look at this region and make a lot of guesses as someone who's just pretty unfamiliar with the group. But that's where I'm leaning there. Let's move on now to Team Colombia, because I think Team Colombia is a very interesting team with one of my personal favorite players in the history of Overwatch on this team. You can see the roster here. They have damage players Dromer, EQO, and Pirino. EQO, of course, formerly on the Philadelphia Fusion, played a lot of very high-level Genji. One of the greatest moments in Overwatch League history comes from EQO and his time on the Fusion in that wild, incredible clutch on Rialto on his Genji. So EQO is a player that we know is very high level, has played at a very high level. He, in my opinion, of the entire region, he is the best player. Yes, he hasn't played in the Overwatch League now for a couple of seasons. He is still a very good player. He's still an incredible talent, and he is still a force to be reckoned with and someone that this team can rely on. And you pair him with Dromer, another player. He is a flex DPS player as well. But this team could reliably play compositions like Tracer Genji by running Dromer and EQO, play some dive compositions, and I think this team would have a very, very good look there. EQO is also pretty flexible. They have flexibility there. That helps quite a bit as well. Piorino, I don't have a ton of information on him. He does not have a Twitter account. But I would imagine Piorino is the primary hit scan player for this team because Dromer and EQO are not necessarily known for being strong hit scan players. So I think that is where Piorino is going to fill out this roster. Moving on to the tanks, you have Super Gomez and Happy Alonso. Happy Alonso, as far as I know, main tank player, plays a lot of Reinhardt in particular. And Super Gomez, my assumption would be that he is the off-tank player for this team. It'll be interesting to see kind of where they lean, if they do run these kind of dive-heavy compositions, if they favor Winston or D.Va. That's kind of really the question mark for this team in that regard. And then you close out with the supports. You have Mixv and Hug. Mixv is your Lucio player, main support player primarily. Hug, flex support player. It'll be interesting to see, right? I think this is an interesting team. I think this is probably my second favorite team in this region in terms of how I think they will do. I think when I look at this team, I look at EQO as a talent. I think that there is a very clear route to victory for this team, right? Invest in EQO, let EQO kind of do what he does. It's a very similar thing to like Proper Go Kill or Kevster Go Kill. It's you invest into EQO. He is arguably the best player in this region. He's arguably the best player in this group, and you have to expect that if that is the case, if they feel like he is the best player and he is the best performing player, I think it could be difficult for some of the teams to stop him. The question is, will the rest of the team be able to enable him enough to kind of find success? We don't know exactly, but I think when you look at this group, you have a lot of unproven and unknown players. The presence of somebody like EQO who has Overwatch League experience and has some of that high-level experience does give you some confidence that he is going to be able to help elevate this team in a way that will have them be competitive with the likes of Brazil and Chile, who I think when I look around are the two other teams that I feel the most confident in their ability to kind of potentially get out of this group. I think they are competitive with those teams, which makes them a pretty good shout to potentially move on from this group. Up next, we have Ecuador. Another interesting, relative unknown roster here. You can see they have players Nobito, Jorel, and Lucho as their damage players. Lucho, I believe is going to be their kind of substitute DPS player on this roster, from what I can tell. They have tweeted out some media that kind of helps. So I get the feeling that Nobito is their primary damage hit scan player, and Jorel is their primary flex DPS player. Tracer in particular, kind of a signature hero there. So that's what I would expect when I look at this team and what they have there. They're telling you right now that's who they're going to be playing the majority of the time. Moving over to the tanks, they have just Emilio X44 or Emiliox 44. So you got to rely on your tank, right? You need your tank to kind of come up big, play a lot of the different heroes. That is what we see. I think Doomfist is going to be the most likely pick there. If that is kind of one of Emilio's best heroes, I'd expect quite a bit of Doomfist based on what I have been able to gather for this team. And then when you go to the supports, you have Cairngorm, Tamanu, and Pabaloon. Cairngorm, one of the only players who's currently with any kind of roster, which is the team Dogmination, which I think was just the team for trying to get into this World Cup qualifiers. Cairngorm is going to be a flex support player, as is Tamanu. That's their primary hero picks. Pabaloon is, I assume, the main support player for this roster, and that is the most likely hero pick there. I think it's an interesting team just because we don't know a lot for what this team is going to be able to do. They don't have a huge name value thing. They don't have one of those superstar players that we're familiar with. This is the first time Ecuador has been in the World Cup, so they're a really big unknown when it comes to the World Cup and kind of the global scene. So I'm really intrigued to see what this team is able to do, because, I mean, I think back to the wildcard games we had last week. They were really interesting to see a team like Portugal with a bunch of unknowns kind of perform well and get a spot in over Ireland, a team who had a little bit more kind of known quantities to them. So when you don't know a lot about the players competing, it is hard to gauge them fully. And that's what we learned this past weekend. So Ecuador is a team, much like Argentina, much like Chile, and much like some of the players in Colombia, where I want to see how these players perform in a scene where we can really see them globally. Because these players are putting in a lot of work behind the scenes. Coaching staffs are very, very important, of course. So Ecuador, we've never seen them on the global stage. I'm curious to see how they are able to perform in this setting in the World Cup, because it's just one of those things that we really have nothing to really gauge for them. Final team in this group is Peru, another team with a lot of relative unknowns. Like I said, kind of the story with South America, but there is some history and experience on this Peruvian roster. You can pull it up here. You can see they have damage players, Andrando, Diego, and Persona. Andrando is going to be one of your damage dealers that I think will probably not be the primary player. I think when you look at who they have on this roster, Persona most likely is going to be the primary hit scan player for this roster. Plays stuff like Ashe, plays Tracer. Does also play Genji. I think Persona's, my guess is the main player for this roster, is a former Contenders DPS player, used to play on the team Patitos back in 2020. So that's my guess. That's who the main player for this roster is. And you have Diego, who is going to be a flex DPS player, and Andrando is going to be the other player kind of rounding out this roster. So it's interesting to kind of look at the damage there and kind of see who they have. Moving on to the tanks, they have a solo tank player, which is Baskerville. When you only have one tank player, you just assume they are able to play a lot of tanks. Based on their Twitter, I know Ramatra, common hero, they play Winston, Sigma, so they play a lot of the kind of currently meta heroes. So I'm not too concerned about them feeling uncomfortable on meta heroes. Their top 4 heroes that I can see in some of the recent tweets: Ramatra, Winston, Sigma, and Diva. So they seem pretty well rounded. They have some Junker Queen experience too. They've played it all, right? They know what they're doing. They have that history playing a bunch of different heroes. And you round out the support line with Suzu, Rodrigo 5D, and Poke. Poke is the primary Flexport player, I believe, for this team. Also played on Patitos back in 2020. Suzu, going to be your main support player. Rodrigo, another main support player. So my guess is Poke is going to be the primary Flexport player, and we'll see Suzu or Rodrigo based on what they need to do. Very interesting team. If you look at their history in the World Cup, they did not do particularly well in 2016 nor in 2019 in the preliminary rounds. They were not one of the teams that made a huge splash in their time in the World Cup. So once again, it is a little kind of tough to figure out where they're going to be. It's just a tough region to break down. But if you look at 2019, Colombia is the only team that actually managed to have some success. They beat the Philippines back then. So there is some success that has been had at times in the past, but I don't even think Peru competed. I can't really see them looking here at the teams from 2019. I don't believe they did, unless I'm just not able to see them for some reason, but I don't think they did. So this is another team, a lot of unknown players, a lot of unknown pieces, but they do have some players who have some Contenders experience with Poke and Persona, which I think will elevate the team. So unsurprisingly, you can see kind of from this video, this is a very, very, very difficult region to kind of judge. It's a lot of unknown players. If anyone out there has any information on some of these players that I don't maybe know, if you guys are following this South America scene closer than I am, let me know. Give me some names or some players that you see that are super exciting and that are interesting and that you think are among some of those kind of stronger talent here. Let me know the team you're most excited for. I think that Brazil is the favorite to get out of this group. Like I said, I think Colombia gives me a little bit more faith because they have EQO. I think having a known player, having a player that has made it to that kind of Overwatch League level is going to be a huge boon for this team. And he was a competitive player. He was a very good player in the Overwatch League as well. Doesn't have the most wide hero pool, but what he's good at, he's very good at, and I think he can elevate this team quite well. And if I look back on what we got last week in the wildcard games, the known players were, generally speaking, the ones who performed the best. And that usually tells you that that's because the players that have that experience are just understand the game at a higher level. They've had better coaching, had better infrastructure. And so I think VQO is the leader of that Colombia team. I think he can lead that team out of this group and to the top 16 for the World Cup. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below on this group. Which teams you think look the best? Which teams you think look the least best? I don't know. It's hard to judge this region, right? And so I'm really curious to kind of see this one. It's why I'm so excited for this group, because we really don't know what to expect as outsiders to this group. If you want to base things on past success or history and experience, there's really nothing to go off of in this region. So I'm fascinated by this group. I'm fascinated by this region, and I'm very excited that we are going to guaranteed have 2 South American teams in the top 16 playing in Anaheim. I think that's phenomenal for the game. It's phenomenal for the future. Maybe one of these teams will help bring back South American Overwatch to the mainstream, but we'll have to wait and see. But that is it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. That's going to be all from me for today. I hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.